So now that it's summer, I figured it's a good time to start this series that I've been wanting to do. So today marks the beginning of a new frontier into metal.
Welcome to Tune Fever, baby.
Okay, everybody, as you can see here, we have metal. Now, metal is not only a material used in Fortnite, but also is a genre of music that is very good. I want to, in this series of videos, kind of break down and explore all of the different subgenres within metal because there's a lot. There's kind of like as many subgenres of metal as there are genres of anything else in general. So I've been kind of taking notes and kind of doing a lot of digging. And in this episode, I basically want to introduce this series and also cover the first subgenre of metal, which is proto metal, which is to say kind of pre-metal or like the very beginnings of metal music. And so I want to cover those things in today's video, but we'll be covering a whole lot of subgenres within metal as we go throughout this series. And since it's summer, thought it's a good time to start doing that. So I want to talk about the word metal for a minute. So, as we have our graphic here, so this is all the visual interest you're going to get here for a while. So take it all in. So people began using the term metal in the late 60s, describing a new trend going on in rock music, and particularly in England as it was beginning. So rock was using themes of horror and the occult. And also around the same time, the guitar was kind of developing from what was previously kind of a monotonous, redundant instrument throughout maybe the 50s. And then the guitar was kind of shape-shifting into something that could be applied to kind of any sound you're really going for. And part of that is the advent of distortion pedals and distortion effects and other kinds of effects. And so there was a lot of experimentation with guitar, you could say in the 60s. And eventually we do come to a thing called metal, which is really into the distorted thing. And it's also pretty low tuned oftentimes. But yeah, we're going to kind of get into the word metal, and then we're going to explore the first genre of proto metal. So going from here, many of the early acts of metal, like these proto metal bands, would inspire future bands to expand on the idea of what metal and hard rock music could be. And through, basically the second half of the 20th century, metal kind of splintered into several pretty unique subsets that kind of took on movements of their own. And so we're going to look at those through the series. And sometimes you look at it and different fans of different genres of metal kind of feud and don't really like each other. And sometimes styles of metal would kind of fuse and form another subgenre that's like a combination of two. So we're going to get into those things as we go through the grand topic of metal in this series. Myself, I've not always been into metal. I kind of got into metal, I guess, really in high school, but I've heard plenty of metal before then. I really liked Metallica in 6th grade or something. And so, but yeah, I really got into metal. I don't know if metal proper, when I was in high school. And so I didn't really grow up with it. Nobody I really knew listened to it. But I ended up just trying to find new music because I really liked music a lot. So I kind of tried to explore metal. And so me discovering metal, it wasn't like being part of a scene or anything like that. It was just me being interested and then getting on the internet basically and looking around and figuring out stuff that I like. and I kind of know what I like and I kind of know what I don't like now. Um, my plan with this series is for each genre of metal to recommend 6 per subgenre, 2 of them being kind of classics that you have to know, and 2 of them being kind of like my favorites, which might kind of be deeper cuts into the genre, like maybe not as classic, but some of my favorite stuff personally. And then also 2 of them being just things that I think are interesting for some reason. Maybe I love them. Maybe I just think they're important, so we have to talk about them. Stuff like that. So I want to recommend 6 per subgenre discussed in this series. So proto metal is sort of pre-metal at a time when the term was first being thrown around. Um, the shift in rock towards extremes was developing. Those extremes including things like speed, volume, distortion, shocking lyrics, screaming vocals, and a kind of primal heaviness that brought the animal out of people. um, or it kind of would put you in your place. It would kind of just be really brutal or aggressive. And so these extremes were kind of taking off at the time. Um, Now, a bit earlier than this time, the boundaries are being pushed. The kind of early 60s, a lot of people were really pushing the boundaries of what kind of acceptable music could be. Guys like Elvis or the Beatles or like Beach Boys or the Rolling Stones or the Kinks. And then going from there, there's dudes like Arthur Brown, who's very crazy. Like Steppenwolf used the lyric "Heavy Metal Thunder" in a song in 1968, and that's a pretty early use of the term. And this is kind of one theory about kind of where the word metal came from, although I'm pretty sure people kind of tossed it around, but it probably became a bit more mainstream around that time. Um, I guess being Heavy Metal Thunder in the song Born to Be Wild, I guess this heavy metal thunder was associated with bikers. And so as you go forward and look at a bunch of metal bands and kind of their look and how they chose to dress, it would be a lot of biker stuff. And so it kind of makes sense. But yeah, just kind of tracing the history, you have a bunch of people who are kind of pushing the boundaries of music. And then guitar at the same time is really kind of branching out and experimenting into other sounds and other ways of being used. And so these two things happening at the same time kind of crash into each other. And this sort of like psychedelic acid blues hard rock um kind of happened, and it became pretty popular, especially in England, for a lot of bands to kind of get into that type of sound. And those are kind of the bands that we're talking about here in proto metal. Now some of the stuff on these albums is not necessarily gonna sound very much like metal, but um when we do look at some of these early proto metal albums, you can definitely hear the roots of metal in them. And I also think that they're awesome. So, yes, the genre number 1 that we will be discussing in this series, proto metal. So, here is what we're going to do. We're going to have a column for classics, a column for favorites, and a column of interesting. So, what we're going to do now is cover our first classic. Here we have Black Sabbath, their self-titled album called Black Sabbath. And it's really the beginnings of the band. And I'm certain that if you like metal, you were probably waiting for me to bring them up. Because Black Sabbath really kind of is the daddy of metal. They're kind of the where metal really became defined, and it became specific. And if you could point to an instance, it would probably be something like this album. So it's good. It is really like championing like doom and gloom on this album. It's a lot of scary things, and there's a lot of like folk elements to it, but it's also really loud and very distorted and meant to kind of shock and terrify. I wouldn't say that it's actually scary, but probably for the time, it's pretty shocking. So that is the first classic that you absolutely must know. Uh, and then secondly, I want to recommend an album by Cream called Disraeli Gears. It's another one of those really where like distorted guitar is super super prominent in it, and it's the legendary trio of Eric Clapton on guitar, Ginger Baker, and then Jack Bruce. These guys kind of did the psychedelic thing, um, and it's really loud with prominent guitars, and so these kind of things kind of pushed it into more dangerous waters where um, it's starting to become something else, and there's a lot of parts of it that really do sound like what is to come in metal. um, and so it's definitely a classic. You definitely have to know it as you're kind of exploring proto metal. So those are the two classics I'm recommending for this particular subgenre. um, Next, I want to talk about some of my personal favorites that I would consider to fall kind of into the proto metal category, this early stuff. So this one is, the band is Night Sun, and it's the album called Morning. Okay, this it's 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 really really heavy and kind of obnoxious in a way, but I really like it. It's kind of like a really heavy prog is what it kind of is. They're from Germany. um I'm calling it proto metal because it's pretty insane. It would probably be pretty freaking nuts live, especially for the time. Came out in 1972, so we're talking this kind of early period. It's very loud. It's in your face. Has a really cool experimental edge to it. It's prog, and plus one of the band members plays organ and sax, and he's really great. So it's kind of unique in that way. So it's definitely my favorite, or a favorite of mine, I should say, within the category that I would consider proto metal. We have another one here that's a big favorite of mine. It's very psychedelic. They're Japanese. It's this group called Blues Creation. When did this one come out? I don't have it written down. Probably 71 or something, or I don't know, early. It is early. Um, yeah, they are a Japanese, basically psychedelic prog band, but they get really, really heavy. And they do also get kind of folksy. But this album's really creative. Yeah, it just doesn't really sound like anything else. Definitely check it out. So I want to talk about some other things that are I'm kind of just, this is like the other stuff category. I love this album, Deep Purple in Rock. It is I mean, there's so many things about Deep Purple that make them extremely important to the progression of, or the starting, the inception of metal, and then the progression of it. Um Very prominent guitar. The vocals of Deep Purple are some of the best in rock in general, or metal. um Ian Gillian or something like that, I'm not sure. uh but yeah, I'm kind of going off the cuff. I have like a little bit of notes written down. Check this album out. Deep Purple has a lot of actually great albums. um I guess they have something that's supposed to come out in 2020. I don't really know. I haven't been following it, but yeah, I guess they're still going or something. But this particular one, it's one of their real early ones, and it's awesome. So I have to recommend it here within the, like, if you wanna get the sound of proto metal and kind of, because that's really what we're doing. We're kind of exploring um, the different subgenres within metal, and I think this is kind of an essential listen if you want to get into that sound and kind of explore. Maybe you're seeing like what kinds of metal you like for yourself. I think that checking this stuff out is really good for that. Okay, next up, album by Blue Cheer. It's called Vincibus Eruptum. Yeah, I'm pretty sure those aren't real words, but I don't know, maybe they are. I'm not sure. Uh, so yeah, this one's from 1968. It's very, very early. It's one that you need to hear. Getting into proto metal, it kind of seems like the gospel truth of acid blues in a way. You could say it's just super heavy, super psychedelic. Um, the guitar player, his name's Lee Stevens. He's pretty relentless. Um, he just completely shreds. Um, yeah, so and the guitar is it's really loud. The guitar is definitely on 10 here, so definitely check it out. Um, Now for proto metal, okay, normally I would just do the 6, right, for most genres, but for proto metal, since we're talking about a bunch of early stuff, I thought that it would be appropriate to include some more. So we're gonna talk about this band, JPT Scare Band, Past Is Prologue, which is happens to be my favorite album of theirs. This is very interesting. Um, they didn't really, gosh, what is it? They're a band that was around since the early 70s, but they never released an album until the 90s. And so they have that proto metal sound, but the stuff is released so much later that it's just kind of weird. It's like why did this album come out in the 90s and it sounded like it came out in 1969 or something. And so that's JPT Scare Band, and this is my favorite by them. It's very doomy and it rocks. So if you want that sound of proto metal, it's very worthy of being checked out. Next up, this one's not a metal album, but I think it's an interesting one to discuss when you're talking about proto metal because this album came out in 1972. And Blue Oyster Cult, you might know them for things like Don't Fear the Reaper and stuff. This particular album, it's not a metal album, but you can tell that Blue Oyster Cult at the time when they released this in 72, I think it's their first album. You can tell that they've been checking out a lot of metal and that they're definitely kind of inspired by the sound. And so there's a lot of these proto metal elements that are incorporated into it that make it a really, really cool album. And so while it's not like a proto metal album, it's kind of an album that might not exist if it weren't for the sound of proto metal. And I definitely think it's really cool to hear the influence in it very strong. Um, so yeah, this is what we have. Here's the words so that if you want to search them, you don't just have to carefully listen to my words and then type what you think I heard, because maybe you'd misspell Disraeli or Vincibus eruptum or something. I don't know. But here's this so you can know how to type your Google searches if you're going to check out some of this music. I fully recommend that you check out all of these. And of course, there's a lot more. But I just wanted to give some kind of my top recommendations if you really just want to get the sound of proto metal in your ear. But yeah, be sure to